Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Insurrect's first ever panel on writing history for the public, which will be discussing the how-tos of writing for the public and some of the structural and emotional roadblocks that come up along the way, particularly for graduate students and junior scholars. Insurrect is an online publication devoted to anti-colonial frameworks and critiques of racial capitalism in early American studies. For folks who are interested in learning more about Insurrect, you can follow Insurrect on Twitter at insurrect_histo and at Insurrect's website, insurrecthistory.com. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Marisa S. Budlong, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm a master's student studying public history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and over the summer, I've been a fellow at Insurrect. I'm happy to introduce the panelists today and later facilitate the Q&A section of the panel. Please DM me with any of the questions that you have, and we'll get to them during the Q&A section. Our first speaker is Dr. Kellen Heniford. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center at Penn State University. She earned her PhD in US history from Columbia University in fall 2021. Dr. Heniford is currently working on a book project entitled Slavery is Slavery: Early American Mythmaking and the Invention of the Free State. She is a founder and editor at Insurrect, where she also runs the website and social media. Our second speaker is Adam McNeil, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Rutgers University, focusing on Black women's lives during the Revolutionary and founding eras in the Chesapeake Bay. In 2021, he became the Omohundro's inaugural OI Audio Fellow, a new fellowship meant to present the fresh histories of the American Revolution via the narrative podcast medium. In addition to academic writing, he regularly contributes to the academic blogs Black Perspectives and the Junto, along with interviewing scholars on the New Books in African American Studies podcast, where he has interviewed nearly 100 scholars about their works in African American studies and African American history. Follow him on Twitter at Cultured Modesty. Our third and last speaker is Dr. Elise A. Mitchell. She is a historian of slavery, gender, and the body in the early modern Black Atlantic. She is currently a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at Princeton University. Dr. Mitchell earned her PhD in Atlantic World and Caribbean and Latin American history from New York University in 2021. She has published articles and essays in the William and Mary Quarterly, The Atlantic Ideas, and Black Perspectives. She is currently working on a book manuscript tentatively titled Morbid Geographies, about the history of smallpox and slavery in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British territories between 1500 and 1800. She is a founder, board member, and editor of Insurrect. And without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Dr. Heniford.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're all going to be talking about slightly different things when it comes to writing for the public. And the thing that I was brought on to talk about is social media, because when we started this, when we were thinking about starting this panel, we talked to some grad students, of which I very recently was one, about what was most intimidating about writing for the public. And one of the things that repeatedly came up was how to promote and interact with your writing on social media and how to interact with people who are interacting with your writing. And so the area of social media that I'm most engaged with is Twitter, which I think is true of a lot of academics, especially when it comes to promoting and showing our own work. I have a face for Twitter, as I like to say, and I really like the media, but I also hate it at the same time. And I think that's the way a lot of people feel about it. And so I just wanted to talk about some strategies for promoting your work and also engaging or choosing not to engage with people who promote that work. And again, I'm coming from this as someone who uses Twitter way too often, but also as somebody who has run Twitter accounts for Insurrect, for a relatively popular sort of left-wing podcast, and a couple of other sort of little things. So I, for better or for worse, have a lot of social media experience. So the first thing that I would say is that when you write something and it goes out into the world, people are going to interact with it. And thinking about Insurrect as one example of a publication, you know, we get a lot of feedback on our the articles that we publish. And luckily with Insurrect, most of it is good. So the point of this panel today is not to convince you to publish with Insurrect, although of course we would love to receive your submissions. But one of the nice things about this sort of the medium that we have is that it's small enough that real trolls are not looking for it to attack it, but big enough that you do get some critical feedback, but it's generally, in our experience, has been positive. That is not necessarily going to be the case if you're publishing with, for example, the Washington Post's Made by History blog, which is, of course, has a bigger readership. It moves, while Insurrect moves outside of the academy, most of our followers on social media are within the academy. And so you're going to be having people who engage with your work in a different way depending on what you publish with. So the first and most important thing that I found about social media, especially when it comes to putting your own work out there, is first of all to just not take things personally. And that is the hardest thing to do probably, but it is probably the most important thing to do, is just know that when you're going on a website like Twitter, people are frequently looking to interpret things in the worst possible way and gain some kind of points for doing so. And maybe you're the person that they're choosing to do that with today, and there's literally nothing you can do about it. The question is, like, if this happens, if somebody interprets your article, for example, in an uncharitable way, how do you respond? And there's a couple of different sort of directions you can go. The first thing you want to do is decide, like, is it even worth it to engage? Maybe it's somebody in your field and it is worth it to actually have a conversation and sort of say, like, you know, I think my critiques of Thomas Jefferson are fair. You know, maybe what you're thinking is, why are you defending him? This guy absolutely sucked, which is generally what I think when I see people on the timeline for some reason still standing Thomas Jefferson. But it's not always great to, like, get in an argument with them in an unprofessional way. Maybe it's a guy who is, you know, tweeting from Richmond, Virginia, and surrounded in his, like, library of Civil War books, but isn't someone in the field per se. He's just a history buff who has very strong feelings about the fact that we shouldn't be tearing down statues. And that's somebody you might be able to engage with a little bit more snark if you want to, but it's important to remember, like, how that's going to look to other people. I think the main thing is thinking through things in terms of, like, what kind of persona do I want to have on this website? And kind of embracing that when you put your writing out there. So my persona is different than Elise's, is different than Adam's, is different than Marissa's. And that doesn't mean that, like, it's a bit of a performance, basically, is kind of what it comes down to. And so I know that my voice on Twitter, which I've honed over years, is a little bit more sardonic. It's a little bit more snarky, but I also don't get in fights with people on Twitter. And that's kind of the line that I've personally chosen to draw on, is that, like, if somebody doesn't like something I say, that's fine. I don't fight with them about it. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the way that anybody engages with this medium. It might be really important to you to defend your ideas online. And I think we can see examples of scholars who do that really well. The main thing that I want to communicate to junior scholars who are thinking about, publishing online or publishing in a print that's going to go online, is that social media is your friend. You can use it to get your name out there, to meet people, to network, and anybody who's going to be sort of negatively interacting with you, the best thing that you can do is ignore it. The second best thing you can do is reply in a polite way. Probably the worst thing that you can do is, like, try to start a flame war, because a lot of us, especially the people on this call, are going to be on the job market, and you don't want to get an sort of known in the Twitter Storians community as being someone who's constantly screaming at random people online. No matter, even if it's not, you know, people who are looking at your job materials, if it's random readers of the New York Times, you don't want to be screaming at them either. And the last thing that I'll say is that I totally get why it is scary to be a person online right now. It feels like the job market is, I mean, it is a disaster. And it feels like you're under a microscope. And I will say that I mentioned earlier, I have a certain persona on Twitter. You can look me up, you'll find me very easily, and you'll see exactly what I mean. And I was in a job interview once, and somebody said to me, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but she said, "You have quite a colorful presence on Twitter." And I was like, oh no. And I did not get that job. But that same person was on a committee for a job that I did end up getting. And so while I was really worried at first that maybe I had, you know, shot myself in the foot by tweeting too often about like how Jeff Bezos should shoot himself toward the moon and miss just slightly and keep going forever, or whatever it is that I say, like, I think you can still be yourself on social media and like do well in this profession. So just like hold on to your voice, don't be combative, and don't take things seriously. And those are probably my 3 biggest pieces of advice when it comes to social media, promoting your writing, and being a person in history in this world. And I think I'll close it there.
Thank you so much. A lot of the things that you talked about with Twitter, I know it can be like so scary, especially for graduate students. That's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, Adam McNeil.
All righty. And if there's someone who has definitely taken Kellen's advice about being themselves on Twitter, I definitely think that I'm one of those people. And I really appreciate y'all for inviting me to being on this conversation. And Insurrect has been an awesome publication and a great space to for me publish in. I convened a roundtable writing discussion of sorts about what it means to be Black and write about Black lives in early African and African American history, or an African American history rather. And you know, able to convene some friends, Geneva Smith and Clifton Sorrell as well, was an amazing opportunity. And you know, I couldn't think of a better publication to publish in. And also, hey, we also know a lot of places they either don't pay or will take very long, i.e., sometimes even multiple months to pay you back, and the check cleared quite quickly. So that's also a great thing as well, because Lord knows many of us know what it feels like to have to continually knock on doors in person and via email about how to get your coin. And so I'm very happy to be here. And so for me today, I could talk about a lot, but what I'll do is since I have about give or take about 10 minutes, and I am a very long-winded person, I think it's best to talk about the podcast. And so prior, Marisa spoke about I'm almost at 100 episodes. Well, number 99 came out last Thursday. And so I am very happy about that. And so with that, I'm going to actually talk about a handful of my interviews, but in particular, I have to take it back to 2017 when I was a master's student in Boston at Simmons University, now or college, now university in Boston, and my thesis advisor, Dr. Jessica Parr, recommended that, hey, I know you talk a lot and you really love, you love like talking about books. And she knows this because literally after the first class I had with her, comparative slavery class, January of 2017, she and I spoke about almost 2 hours after class, and the class ended after 8 o'clock. So yeah, I love talking about books and such. And so she suggested that I apply for one of the positions that are opening up at the New Books in African American Studies podcast. And she did it. She said that because she wanted me to have a leg up in trying to get into PhD programs. And she was very much right, because ultimately I chose to go because I didn't expect to be on for now almost 5 years and almost 100 episodes in. It was honestly just so I can get into PhD programs. So if you scan those early episodes from Shawande Musakim at Wash U, or Nikki Taylor, who's at Howard University, or a handful of my early interviews, you'll notice a theme that if you know me personally at the time, you would know that a lot of the people who I interviewed were those who I wanted to work under as a graduate student in a PhD program. And none of those people were actually anywhere that I went for my PhD, either at University of Delaware or at Rutgers. But working with the podcast opened me up to opportunities to not only write for the public through Black perspectives, and also the Junto or Junto, or however the hell you say the actual word. I still don't know, to be quite honest with you. It depends on who you speak to. But for these publications, it was in part through my work with New Books that people started to get to know me as well. And so I bring that up because one of the things I quickly realized while interviewing people was a love of not only wanting to know more about the actual book, like the actual contents of the book, but that I really wanted to get more inside, right? So thinking about the footnotes, endnotes, the acknowledgments, because really those three sections are really where you can get into the meat and the teeth of how the book was actually produced. And so those questions are really what underpin my love of podcasting, and also not only podcasting, that's the medium, but more so convening conversations so that people have an opportunity to speak broadly and more in depth also about their books. And so as I went through, like I said, I transferred from the University of Delaware after the 2018-2019 school year, and transferred to Rutgers University to work with my now advisor, Dr. Eric Armstrong Dunbar. It's been such a pleasure. But one of the great things as well about working with Dr. Dunbar is also realizing that there's a whole world outside of just the standard academic publishing world that your PhD can help you get to. And so I don't know if I'll be writing a Gilded Age or be a part of a Gilded Age style a television program, but in terms for me thinking about where's my area of influence. And that's why for me, focusing on podcasts is so important. And that's because as someone who had to do their comps when the pandemic was in chapter 1, I don't know what chapter we're in now, but it's a double-digit number, probably in the dozen, over 2 dozen by now. But in these early areas of the pandemic, I realized I can't go to the library. I can't do what people during the before times had done to get books, going to the library, just sitting for X amount of time. I had to do it from my room. And as someone who likes to listen to audio books or to listen to lectures, because the way that I learn, it's best to do that. It's best to do it that way. And so that's why for me, it's also very important to think about how we learn. And so for me, podcasts are really that way to do it. And so in the time that I have left, the couple episodes that have really helped me, and also for other people as well who have replied back to some of my interviews via email or Twitter. I interviewed Dr. Jennifer Morgan a couple years ago for her the anniversary of Labor and Women, and such an amazing book. It has been really on so many people's syllabi, but it was also coming up upon the 16th anniversary of the publication of the book. And so I wanted to convene a conversation. And so what I actually did was I actually ended up interviewing her not only about laboring women, but going behind the scenes of the fact that I realized from her conversation that she was on the road for effectively a year and a half in archives across the Caribbean, the US South, and the UK, and then realizing, some of these more in-depth stories that we really weren't able to get prior to. And so that's why for me, that publication is really important. But then also as an additional component, I ended up convening 3 scholars who were influenced by the book and also worked with Professor Morgan. These were people like Dr. Natasha Lightfoot, Dr. Jessica Johnson, and also a friend of mine, a graduate student who actually works with Dr. Johnson, Hallie Ashby as well, who works at Hopkins. And so this is an opportunity to think intergenerationally about how laboring women have affected all of them as well, and also kind of looking forward towards the future of work as well. And so I did that as well with Michelle Roth-Trujillo's Silence in the Past, who also had an anniversary recently as well, and convened Dr. Neil Roberts, Dr. Bradley Craig, a friend of Insurrect, and of the McNeil Center as well, along with Dr. Crystal Eddings as well, to kind of think about why, their interactions with Michelle Roth-Trujillo, and why, in terms of the work, but also why the book is so important and is also cited so much. And so also I convened a conversation on Du Bois's Black Reconstruction as well. And all of these things are happening during these early chapters of the pandemic. I've also had conversations where it's not actually about books. It's about getting behind the scenes of a career in African-American studies, like with Dr. Imani Perry from Princeton as well, conversing with her about her own writing process. How does someone write 3 books or get 3 books published within, 5 years? How does that happen, right? So, and we get into things like that, along with articles. So I interviewed Dr. Catherine Benjamin Golden from the University of Delaware about her important, I think, a very, very important article from the Journal of African American History, Armed in the Great Swamp, Fear, Maroon Insurrection, and the Insurgent Ecology of the Great Dismal Swamp. And so, and the reason why I chose her for this is because I thought her article was great, but also there are many articles that are like important, pioneering, that I think deserve attention as well. And it's a way, going back to some of the people who I interviewed about these books, getting junior scholars, graduate students onto these platforms as well for CV credit, and to have a space to think publicly about some of the work that most influenced them as well. And most recently, I interviewed Peter Wood, who's Black majority Negroes in colonial South Carolina from 1670 through the Stoner Rebellion. The book version was published in 1974, but the dissertation version was completed in 1972. So we're 50 years in. And so that's my most recent one. And to me, part of the reason why I chose to talk about the podcast for our time here is because the topic is writing history for the public. But the public consumes history in many different ways, in addition to writing, but also through podcast mediums. And so I see podcasts and these conversations as part of a broader discussion about writing for the public, because these books influence, as the Lord knows with the culture wars, they influence the public in good and also bad ways. So trying to give space to think about different interpretations and different ways of writing, and also not only different ways of writing, but different ways of communicating, ultimately, because writing is a form of communication. And so that's why, for me, podcasting is so important. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to produce usable histories for the public. And whether that's writing, whether that's podcasting, there are a lot of different ways to do it. And so I've written for different publications, but podcasting is very much fun. And that's why I look forward to later this year when my podcast on Black Loyalist Women comes out with the Alejandro Institute, just in time for the upcoming conference. And so looking forward to the conversation, looking forward, and gonna pass it off to my friend, Dr. Elise Mitchell. But y'all should check out her article, her piece in Black Perspective that just came out.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about writing process. But first, I just wanted to clarify that I don't quite identify as a public historian. With new developments in the field of public history, graduate and certificate and fellowship programs in the field, and the labor demands placed on public historians, I think it's important not to obscure the expertise of people like Marisa and Adam. Like, you know, Adam's done 100 public-facing interviews and written numerous pieces for the public. And so in comparison, I've only written 3 single-authored essays for the public and collaborated on a number of public-facing publications as a co-author and an editor. Thus, I see myself more as a historian who occasionally writes for the public but not a capital P public historian. So with that said, take everything that I say about process with a grain of salt. The only training I've received for writing for the public was an op-ed project workshop while I was a graduate student at NYU. They taught us how to write an editorial in 2 days. And I wrote all 3 of my public essays now in 3 or 4 day periods. However, writing is only a small part of my entire process. My op-ed in The Atlantic was pitched to me. They gave me an open-ended topic, supply chain disruptions, and my expertise, the history of smallpox. My 2020 piece in Black Perspectives was the first and only public essay I wrote without a prompt. And my recent Black Perspectives piece, the one that came out today, was a response to a CFP on Black women and the history of reproduction. So saying yes to pitches or submitting to CFPs can eliminate some of the anxiety and labor of figuring out whether your idea is of interest to a publication. My writing process tends to start with a conversation. I typically spend about 1 or 2 weeks discussing my essay ideas with non-academic friends, family members, and acquaintances, sometimes even strangers. I've been known to hold Uber drivers hostage, talking about history. And I tend to just try to focus on tweaking the idea to make conversation. I've noticed that good conversation topics often make good essay topics. And if you can hold someone's attention in conversation, you can hold their attention in an essay. Like conversation, essays for the public can't be overly detailed, jargony, or too in the weeds of your research. It's just skimming the surface, like small talk, but a little bit deeper. The tone you aim to strike is similar to a conversation. You don't want to talk down to your audience, just like you wouldn't talk down to someone you were talking to, even when you're the expert. You also don't want to overcomplicate things. Taking 1 or 2 weeks to refine my conversation points makes it easier to turn them into 2 to 3 key points in my essays. And that's really all you have room for in a few hundred words. This isn't a journal article or a book chapter, it's just a brief essay. After having conversations about the topic, if it's worthy, I take about a week just to jot stuff down and read more. I cannot stress this enough. Read essays and op-eds if you want to get better at writing them. Pick a journal or pick a journalist or a public intellectual and follow their work. You know, we've already brought up the Washington Post, Black Perspectives. There are a number of different publications that you can choose from to do a deep dive and read and find people that you'd like to follow. Reading Insurrect, like Black Perspectives, Age of Revolutions, The Pano, Nursing Clio, and Contingent Magazine are some of our inspirations. Reading them will help you find models and develop a formula for writing essays fit for publication. It will also help you feel less anxious about pitching or writing for different outlets because you will know what they expect. The types of things I jot down over the week include facts, links to references, conversation points, full sentences, sentence fragments, sometimes rough ideas about the op-ed, maybe even a rough outline of where I want to start and how I want to end. And I usually pick out a couple of key terms. During the week of reading and jotting things down, I don't put any pressure on myself to write anything substantive. After that week is up, I take a Friday or Saturday afternoon, pull out the op-ed project's outline and fill out their outline template. Then I write a usually terrible, like absolutely terrible first draft of the essay. And then I take a break. I just leave the terrible draft, let it sit and fester for like 1 or 2 days. On the 3rd or 4th day, I sit down and rip the first draft apart and overhaul it with edits. I revise some more, read it aloud, proofread. And if I have someone handy, I let them read it. And then I just hit send and let fate do what it will. The thing is that good editors will always have notes and comments. So whatever you submit doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough. What my grandmother says is perfect's worst enemy. And once it's good enough, the editors will take you the rest of the way, so trust them. So in conclusion, I just want to share a couple quick notes on coping with anxiety and coping with the aftermath of publication. This is echoing some of what Kellen said too. So I find that having lots of conversations about what I plan to write lessens my anxiety and makes writing much easier. I also have developed a daily writing practice. So overall, writing is easier for me than it once was. Writing daily toward any project will help you build your overall confidence and skill, enabling you to write essays more efficiently. Also, only allowing 3 to 4 days to actually write and edit the piece condenses the anxiety and enables me to push through. I'm always nervous before things come out. I meditate, pray, and work out like anyone else to deal with that feeling. I was doing 2-a-days leading up to this thing coming out in Black Perspectives because I was so nervous. Most of the feedback I've gotten after something is published has generally been positive and affirming. However, there have been times where people have sent me unprofessional and even hostile emails about my writing or demanding unnecessary changes post-publication. I don't do bullies and trolls. So I forward those emails to the editors of publications if they're asking for post-publication changes. And I also forward them to mentors asking for advice about how to proceed. And I CC the hostile sender on those emails because people do those types of things to bully you in secret. Let it be known. Again, I don't do bullies and trolls. I'm very liberal with the block function on social media. I do not engage trolls on social media. I also pay for a service that periodically deletes my information online, making it harder for someone to threaten me or dox me. There are a number of these services. There's one called Team Delete Me that's relatively affordable. And so I'm happy to answer any questions or provide more detail about my process during the Q&A, but thank you all so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to hear your process and how you like sort of like the tangible details. I think sometimes those can go really unseen. So it's great to hear those and know exactly what your process is. And this is just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, please direct message me and I will share them. I have, as someone who is looking to establish myself within academia, why should I write for a public audience versus a traditional academic journal? Does anyone want to take that on?
I'll go ahead and start. So they're two different things. And I think that they're complementary. Writing for academic journals is definitely still the gold standard for a lot of people on the academic track. You can't replace a peer-reviewed journal article with something that you've published in an online outlet, or even something that you've published in an established online magazine. Like my Atlantic piece is not weighted the same in anyone's eyes as my William and Mary quarterly article, right? But at the same time, you can take things like what I did in my piece today, where I took a book chapter that I had written about fading illness and pulled out some of the examples and rethought them in the context of current events around the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so in that way, that work can be complementary. And then you also get your work out there, as Adam and Kellen were saying, in terms of exposure. If the point of writing journal articles and writing book chapters is for other people to read them, if you integrate that with your public writing, you're able to get that work in more people's hands. I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten today asking for copies of my book chapter after people read my essay in Black Perspectives. So I think that always seeing them as separate but complementary things is important. It's not necessarily one or the other. Also, you don't have to write for the public if you don't want to. If it's not something that you enjoy, if you don't see, if this type of consciousness raising work, because I see it as consciousness raising work, that's the tradition that I come out of. If that doesn't appeal to you, you don't have to do it. It's not a requirement. But I will say that even for my postdoc, the mentor who offered me this postdoc and helped create it for me, heard me speak on podcasts and read my shorter online pieces before I had published anything else. So it does, it can open up opportunities for you within academia. Don't think that this is just sort of fluff or dismissive, even though the tenure track tends to dismiss this work. People do value it. And it can be incredibly rewarding work too, to have taken a concept and drilled it down and made it accessible to more people.
just to add to what Elise is saying, I feel like they're two such different things that I don't think they would be in competition with each other. For example, I just had an article come out with the Journal of the Early Republic, and that process took, it started with a talk I gave in 2019, and it came out as an article in like literally exactly 3 years later. The last piece I wrote for the public was on Insurrect, actually, and I spent 1 day on it. And so it feels like in some ways they're both forms of writing, but they're comparing apples to oranges. And if you're compelled to do both, you should do both. Because I mean, as long as you're not, you know, every 3 weeks putting something else out for the public, it probably shouldn't interfere that much with writing articles for journals like the WMQ or the JER or whatever.
Okay, I think this is a follow-up question for Dr. Mitchell. Does your writing process vary depending on the length of your work, or is it the same regardless of length?
So this is just my writing process for writing like op-eds and short essays for the public, typically online forums like Black Perspectives, in my case, The Atlantic. If I were to write for Insurrect, I traditionally don't write where I edit because I have too many internal qualms about doing that for myself. But so this is just my process for that type of writing. And that type of writing is typically the length that Insurrect asks for, of like 750 to maybe max 1,500 words. If I ever had the opportunity to write a longer essay for the public, it might take me a little bit longer, but I also kind of like sticking to that word limit for the things that I write for the public. And that I found doesn't take me more than the 3 or 4 days. The op-ed project teaches you to write, I think, 1,000 word or 1,000 to 1,200 word essays in 2 days. And they like drill it into you to do it in 2 days, which is good. But I found that I need a day of I need 1 or 2 days of rest in between all of that.
Thank you. Okay, I have, what practices do you all engage for following CFPs for both public writing and academic outlets, for anyone?
Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, part of my job is actually, I'm the National Social Media Director for the Association for Black Women's Historians. So literally my job is to impart every single week, at least notes. Like every single Monday, there is a huge, job newsletter along with CFPs as well that I think people would be interested in. And so, I think, so the quick part is Twitter, but also thinking about where I source them from, HNet, Academic Jobs Online, also looking at Interfolio as well. Interfolio is a little harder. Well, actually, no, those are more jobs. The CFP parts won't be on there. But also thinking about for jobs, higheredjobs.com or .net or whatever. But yeah, I think I also think too that there's a way that maybe being closer to the job market it's inherent. You're gonna see more of these because usually they overlap. But usually the job boards, at least HNet especially, has everything. But also sometimes being connected with institutions like the McNeil, who always flood your email with stuff. So yeah.
Just a quick addition to that, we've talked a lot about Twitter today. I completely understand being like, I do not want to deal with Twitter, and that is your right as a person to not have to deal with Twitter. But it might not be a bad idea to create an account, not tweet and not follow anything but the kinds of accounts that do tweet out that information. And that way you don't get all the noise. If you don't want to deal with it, you don't have to put your name on it. It can be completely anonymous and just a place that you go for resources. But I do think, for better or for worse, so much happens on that website that it is good to at least be a little plugged in to that whole world.
Thank you. Okay, another question. How do you establish your expertise on topics related to current events for public writing compared to more senior scholars?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Kellen.
No,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so just as a brief thing, like I took a meeting a few months ago with the people from Made by History at the Washington Post, which I mentioned earlier. And a lot of places are really interested in publishing junior scholars. There's an assumption that I think we make as people who are younger, people who are not as established, that people aren't interested in our voices, and that's simply not true. Whether it's that arena or like a variety of others, it can actually be seen as a good thing that you're a fresh face and that you have new ideas, and that is in some ways a weird ageist thing, that established people can't be cutting edge, which we know isn't true. But there are actually ways that in the eyes of editors, your sort of relative greenness can actually work for you. So the biggest thing to do is not worry about establishing yourself as an expert, but quiet the voice in your own head that tells you that you're not.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I 100% agree with that. Quiet the voice in your own head that tells you that you're not. And also, if you're really concerned about it, then make your first publication submissions to CFPs or to forums like Insurrect, where there's a robust editorial team, so that you can trust that if you're uncertain about something, there's someone who's going to not call you out on it, but help you through working through those challenges. I mean, like for me, my first piece for the public was the Atlantic piece, and they pitched me. And when I got an email from the Atlantic, I didn't think that I was an expert on pandemics. I was still finishing my PhD. And I actually got very scared because I was like, if the Atlantic is emailing me, we must really be in trouble. So, and then after a while, I kind of started to find my voice a little bit more. I definitely felt like I had more of a voice in the second piece. I had thought about writing something in response to Roe and wasn't quite sure if it would be up to snuff, which is why I felt comfortable submitting to the CFP where it would be vetted. It's not like editors are just going to publish you wherever. If they do, then it's probably a very irresponsible publication where you don't want to publish anyway.
Thank you. And sort of like a slight follow-up is, how do you deal with like writing for the public and sort of the demand to engage with those like timely topics?
I think that, in terms of, I think the timely part is tough, because now I was thinking about this through Sheer a couple of weeks ago when we were down in New Orleans, and thinking about what happens when a particular topic becomes commodified. And so thinking about like, okay, how do you wrestle with the fact that you have particular expertise on a particular topic that is timely in whatever way that means in the particular work's case, and then some publications do pay you, and thinking about how to manage that, because as people who write about the histories of African and African American people and Black people more broadly, always thinking about wanting to write and to produce the work that you believe that you can do, but also at times also thinking about where does a topic become then its own form of a commodity? Where does an idea then become described into a commodity? And that's been something that I've been thinking about as well, as I've been dipping my toes more in the publication and the publishing world. And so that's just maybe not a direct answer, but more of something I've been mulling over more broadly about, at times white folks writing about Black histories and trying to understand why. So that's more of a mulling, but.
Just to share some thoughts that, again, I got from some of the editors at Made by History. This speaks to maybe what Adam was saying about directly commodifying your knowledge and histories, but One thing that you can do, there are ways to be strategic about this. So like, obviously you can't necessarily predict the future, but there are ways to think about what might be coming. So when we got the early draft of Dobbs, for people who are especially historians of reproductive history, that's a sign that, like, hey, this is going to be important. I have some expertise. Even just drafting something and being like, this is in my back pocket for when this drops. Like, you're not necessarily going to get the same kind of sign that we did when whoever leaked that decision leaked it, but that's an example of a time when you can be like, okay, I'm getting ready. Another thing is to be aware of anniversaries, holidays, celebrations that are going to be coming, and thinking about ways that you can talk about them and relate them to your work. So, you know, if there are things that are relevant, if you're a labor historian, like Labor Day is a time that's great, or, you know, May Day is a time that's great to be thinking about maybe publishing or pitching something. You want to do it obviously in advance so that they can be published around that time. But there are thinking about ways that you can predict what will be interesting, popular, timely, can help you get ready to publish something.
The person who asked this question should, if it's available to them, do an op-ed project workshop, because they teach you to write in 2 days specifically for this reason, so that if something happens, you can respond within 48 hours, and you can pitch within 24. Because they teach you how to pitch first, and then they teach you how to actually write the piece. I would say for me, as someone who values writing for the public and does so occasionally, I only respond to things that I really feel moved to respond to. And I think that that's a good way of gauging your expertise on a topic too. If you're willing to go the extra mile of like reading a lot of news articles, if you're tapped into, like in my case with my recent Black Perspective piece, I was tapped into some networks of reproductive justice organizers and things like that, then you can then it makes it easier to write something timely in a timely manner. But if you're constantly, I would say that it can take up a lot of time and psychic energy to constantly be looking for a way to sort of insert your history into something. And you kind of want to be careful about doing that, like Adam said, in terms of like the commodification aspect. So I would just say, like, you know, again, like echoing everything that Kellen said, and then also learning how to write things quickly. And there are tools and teams of people who are willing to teach you that skill.
Thank you. Okay, do you find it difficult to get audience buy-in for topics related to early modern period? How do you translate the differences between then and now and make the early modern legible and interesting for a broad audience?
Elise?
I know everybody's looking at me. Okay.
I go on now.
How do you make the early modern interesting? Well, I mean, I always lean into why I find the early modern period interesting. I'm interested. And if I can make my interest translatable to other people, then I think that, you know, so much of our world is rooted in early modern history so there are so many legacies from early modern history in the present that it isn't hard to see those connections. I think that what becomes important in terms of acknowledging the differences then is to acknowledge key differences and paint a picture of context for your audience, because they are intelligent, but they might not know the same things that you know about context. And also always openly acknowledging that things are different now than they were in the past. And I try to like say that explicitly sometimes when I write things that are making comparisons or talking about legacies. But I think if you're interested in the early modern period, then why are you interested in that? Interrogate it and figure out a way to make that legible to other people. Also, there are some people who are also other early modern history geeks who don't need you to make a huge connection to the present either. And like part of founding Insurrect is that it's a place where if you want to stick to the early modern period, you can. And write for the public. You can write pieces for Black perspectives that stick to the early modern period if you want to. There are lots of different forums that will allow for that. Maybe not the Washington Post, maybe not the Atlantic, but there are other outlets where you you can do that.
Thank you. Okay, could the panel speak to the role of historians in K through 12 education?
They're huge. You know, I was going back to even Sheer, I was actually on a flight from New Orleans to Houston, my connecting, and I sat next to a woman named Miss Nelva Williamson, who's a Black teacher at a high school in Houston that's actually a part of this first cohort of teachers teaching the AP African American Studies course that's coming up. And so thinking about our conversations and thinking about her experiences and other teachers' experiences, like I'm in Georgia now, I'm from Florida. What I write about is early Virginia history, or at least 18th century Virginia history. And so thinking about those different places, along with where she teaches in Texas, some of the most hostile states to the histories that I write about. And so thinking about folks like her, and also thinking about the kind of work that they would actually be able to use in their classrooms are oftentimes not the articles, right? But these pithy 1,000 word, 1,500 word essays. Now high school students can't digest it. I just got finished teaching a short African American history and culture class for high school students this summer. And yes, they can digest the ideas and they're on it. They're effectively freshmen in college. That's the kind of audience that the classes are going for. So I think that when we think about what is more easily accessible for high school teachers rather, K through 12 folks more broadly, the things that we write, these short pieces for Insurrect, Black Perspectives, and Junto, and all these other publications, those are the more easily accessible ones, especially because they don't got to pay for it, which I think is the other, the paywall aspect of it as well. But then again, made by history, if I'm not mistaken, you still generally speaking, I believe, have to pay, but not for the others.
Yeah, I wasn't totally sure with this question exactly what they meant, but I think it's important to note that people who work in the K through 12 industry also have really important things to say about history. And actually at Insurrect, like, we have published high school history teachers writing about how they teach and think about history. I don't know if there are any high school teachers on this class, but if there are, or on this call rather, at least at Insurrect, we really value your expertise and we recognize it. And so again, the purpose of this call is not to pitch you to write for Insurrect, but we would love for you to write for Insurrect. And I also know that my high school has assigned Insurrect articles for high school history classes. So they're getting read at that level as well, as Adam suggested. And as I think we all know, K through 12 is really the front lines of a lot of the culture wars fights over history. And so it's K through 12 teachers are doing really incredible and really important work right now.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, how do you go about finding the best and most impactful outlets for your work?
Publish what you read. Publish where you read. Yeah, that's kind of how I go about it. And I think, yeah, just if it's a place that you like, because you want to take pride in your work. That's something that my advisor Jennifer Morgan would say to me, that it's important that we take pride in our work. So publishing someplace where you're going to feel proud is the best and most impactful outlet. And I yeah, that's really all I have to say about that.
I think it's important to think about, be realistic about what you're publishing, what your audience is, and where they're going to look, and also the politics of the place that you're publishing and what they generally publish. So as Elise said, certain outlets may not be interested in pure early modern history, but some outlets might be. Some outlets are not going to publish an article that, make certain political claims, and some outlets will. We've already talked about Insurrect, obviously. I'm thinking about like the Activist History Review. That's another example of a place where you can put like aggressively political sort of left-wing writing that, even if it's incredible, fantastic stuff, is not going to get put on the op-ed page of the New York Times. And so I think another thing too to think about is like, what am I trying to say and who am I trying to say it to, and what publications have, you know, have those audiences and have those politics, basically.
Okay, thank you so much. We have time for one more question. Okay, so what kinds of articles is Insurrect looking for, just to finish this off?
Anything that you feel strongly about that has a grounding in early American history in some capacity, and that takes a stance on an issue in sort of our ideological tradition. And so it doesn't, you know, we've published things that are about transness in the archive, that are about the way that we navigate archival spaces, about maps, about how we read documents. We've published things that are like really more pure history. Here's a thing that happened and here's the interpretation of it. We've published stuff that is about sort of the politics of campuses, whether that's like labor organizing, cops off campus, sexual violence in the academy. We have published reflections on current events, like we had a roundtable for the inauguration in 2021 that was where different people teaching at different levels reflected on how they were going to teach the inauguration in light of the January 6th events. And so the point I'm trying to make is that we publish a wide range of stories and articles and topics. And so it's really about like your imagination more than it is about like any limits that we place on things. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Elise.
Well, we do place limits, and those limits are the number of words. So 350 to 750 words is a short piece. 750 to 1,000 words is a long piece. We often get people who send us pitches. We prefer to see the whole piece. We also often get people who send us full dissertation chapters, sometimes 20 pages of things. We can't work with that. So make sure wherever you submit, whether it's Insurrect or someplace else, although I really hope that this encourages some of you to submit to Insurrect, please make sure that you're adhering to the conventions of whatever publication you're sending to, or else it's just, you just get a flat denial. People won't even read what might be a really wonderful piece or could become a really wonderful piece. And also don't try to take the dissertation chapter. I feel like I'm using a lot of don'ts, but this is the most explicit I can be. Don't take a dissertation chapter or a book chapter and try to squish it into 1,000 words. Take a piece, just a piece, and then elaborate. Sometimes I find that oftentimes with these essays for the public, less is more in a lot of ways.
And can I make one more plug for Insurrect too? As someone who has gone through the editorial process with the group, I think one of the parts that I think is the best quality for a graduate student to go through, especially for those, especially who have sites for academic writing, until you go through an actual editing process, you don't really know what's involved. Now, it's obviously not an article or an academic article, like a timeline, like, you know, Kellen mentioned the amount of years between, you know, the presentation and the publication. But one of the parts that I really enjoyed about writing for Insurrect was also the editorial process and the feedback. Some of it was line editing, some of it was ideal, you know, more so the idea space. This also goes to Black perspectives. And so I think especially for graduate students who have not yet published for publications, I think this is a really valuable experience. And depending on where you go to graduate school, it might be the most in-depth feedback that you might actually get. It's not personal experience, but I know of other people. So that's just putting that out there. So, once again, hope everyone publishes through Insurrect because it's such a great publication. And the political elements, I think, are really important too. But sometimes people really want to talk they talk in an article, in a piece, 1,000 words, but would rather do it through an Insurrect rather than on Twitter, through the actual words, right? So I think we all know what I mean there. So thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you all. This has been so helpful as like a current graduate student, hearing all your experiences. So I really appreciate it. So I just want to thank Dr. Kellen Heniford, Dr. Elise A. Mitchell, and Adam McNeil. It's been really great to hear your perspectives. And thank you for everyone who attended. Yeah.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Have a good one, y'all.
Have a good one. Thank you.